is Neba Sere, and I'm very excited to celebrate the Architecture Foundation's 30th anniversary today by presenting Green Park Station, a project by Elsie Owusu OBE. Elsie has always been an architect that I have personally admired and aspired to. She's one of the very few Black female architects in the public eye in London and the UK and internationally. And it's really exciting to be able to point to a building that she, a Black woman, has designed and developed and delivered in the heart of London. I've chosen Green Park Station as it connects with a lot of themes that are very pressing in the architectural discourse today. It touches upon questions such as how to develop a sustainable and inclusive city, how we can look at healthy streets and green streets, the accessibility of public infrastructure, and what barrier-free design might look like. And we also noticed that to this day, a lot of London tube stations aren't step-free or have step-free access. So as an aspiring architect myself, my practice is centered around understanding the process of decolonizing the architecture profession and thus the built environment, specifically looking at how citizen-led initiatives can have a say on and long-term impact on how we design the spaces and how we inhabit spaces. I've done this through co-founding Black Females in Architecture, BFA, which is an advocacy organization, membership network and social enterprise. We have over 380 members. And we are working to empower Black women in the architectural design industry. With my current role as Senior Project Officer at the Greater London Authority, I am managing projects that the Mayor of London helps fund in the northeast of London. Yes, I think I would now like to introduce our really great guest today. I'm very honored to introduce you to Elsie Owusu OBE. Elsie is an architect, a specialist conservation architect, interior and urban designer. You have a very keen interest in how architecture and city planning is connecting to the arts. And you've also worked with artists closely in your practice, I would say, for a while. You've also have been extremely integral to a lot of aspiring architects from underrepresented groups. And I know many of them from my generation who've worked with you, crossed paths with you, or who you've mentored. And I think you specifically are integral in terms of how they can develop their professional practice, looking at the business of architecture and to be able to go out in the world and carry out projects. This is not necessarily something you learn in architecture school, I would say, unless you go on and do your part 3. And it seems like we are trained to become employees rather than business owners. So yeah, I think over to you to maybe elaborate on a few of these things that I have mentioned.
So thanks very much for inviting me to do this really exciting talk. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very, very happy to talk to you, Neba. The first thing that I suppose I would say is that architecture is very much a team sport. And on that basis, I'd like to point out that I was a leader of that team, and it wasn't a solo project. So I would just really like to really praise the team, the landscape designers, the engineers, the people who were in charge of the mechanical and electrical, of which was a huge part of the project. And I suppose the architecture is a bit like, or the lead architect is a bit like a conductor in charge of a very large and expert team who assemble, have a score put in front of them, you know, practice, 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 and then create this wonderful piece of magic, which is Green Park Tube Station. So, that's really my sense of who an architect, of my sort of architect. I mean, there are very many different sorts of architects, but my sort of architect aspires to be a conductor and part of a team.
I think looking at the actual Green Park Station as a project and the design surrounding it, Green Park Station was part of a wider master plan that you've developed and designed when you were part of Feilden+Mawson. Yes, and you told me that you were it was a very fast-paced project, and as it has to be finalized for the London Olympics 2012. And I think there was a focus on making the station accessible, because especially back then there weren't that many accessible stations. I've been there recently on a lovely walk, and it was very sunny, and it was really interesting to see how you have the opportunity, how anyone really has the opportunity to walk out straight into the park, and be greeted by the Diana fountain. It was a very lovely experience to be able to walk into a green space straight from a tube station. And I think the ramp is a very integral part of the design. You can also see people on a sunny day sitting on the landscape molds that you created, and very close to the wildflower meadows. Do you want to talk a little bit about the design and the project generally as a master plan and the thoughts that went into it?
So Green Park Station is quite an ancient station, and it sits at the heart of the network. And it was made very clear to us that if for some reason the escalator barrel went down, and escalator barrels are notoriously sensitive, then you've got the potential of the Piccadilly line, the Victoria line, the Bakerloo line, and all the transport around it, that central node, gridlocking. So, there was a fair bit of pressure on, and somebody said making that station work was like performing open heart surgery on a marathon runner whilst they were still running. So it was, I have endless respect for the engineers and the people who kept the station running whilst all the work was being done. Part of the history dates even further back than the 16th and 17th century. But essentially, it had become a hub for getting into the West End, basically. You got onto the train and then you were thrown into Piccadilly, sort of blinking into the daylight. And I don't know how many people were aware that there was the connection with the park. But when we started to look at the master plan at Feilden+Mawson, we just thought what a missed opportunity it was to make this connection into the glorious park, and also to combine it with step-free access. So the original brief was that we must have step-free access on a certain number of key stations on the network, and Green Park was one of them. And so with Alan Robson and Pavel Nazadil, who was a colleague of mine from the Czech Republic, wonderful, wonderful, talented architect, we came up with this plan of opening, combining step-free access and the ramp, and bringing people into the park. Working with my friend and landscape designer, the wonderfully named Katarina Malmberg-Snodgrass, we together, and with the others, I mean, there must have been 50 people easily in the team. And so to work with 50 people and to come up with something that seems quite modest, but beautifully coherent, and doesn't dominate, but is integrated into that landscape. I feel very proud of it, and I think it was and is a real achievement. And then Art on the Underground, of course, came in and worked with John Maine, one of the Royal Academicians, to produce that beautiful piece of sculptural work, which also sits very neatly into the design. And I think that, for me, one of the wonderful things is to have that ramp and the green wall, which Katarina and her team put together. So we were talking about a green wall, and London Underground, TfL, were very concerned that, specification for a green wall, you could end up with something which is just a load of brown leaves hanging off. Because green walls are a great concept, right? But, they do require maintenance, and they do need a lot of TLC. So Katerina's team came up with this planting regime, which effectively allows the green wall to grow itself over a period of time. So it needs minimum maintenance. And then, of course, you know, who would have thought a wildflower meadow in the middle of central London? But then when you go there and people are sitting and having their picnics, and the Diana fountain, which was repurposed from another part of the site, and just has now become a sort of a real rendezvous, a point of meeting. And of course, the Piccadilly exit still works as well as it does, but then it gives you this kind of two ways of being in the station and around the station, and making access not just a simple utilitarian process, but a real joy and a beautiful experience. So I mean, I am really proud to have been part of that team and to have provided some leadership.
That's really interesting to hear. I think it's just a very lovely experience to be there and be able to walk right into the park. Something else that strikes me is the attention to detail and the materiality of the design alongside the technical engineering. I think the station, as you said, sits very nicely in the landscape. It almost becomes invisible, while the copper shelter is something that kind of resonates with the surrounding materials of the buildings. And I think the artwork on the actual stone is also something interesting. It would be nice to hear more about that.
The artwork, well, well, I mean, I can't praise enough Art on the Underground and the process that they went through, which was a long and complicated process to identify just the right artist who would not, as it were, dominate and put a stamp on what were quite a delicate series of interventions. So when you look at the work, you look at the indentations, the shells, and you also look at how that then gets brought down into the ticketing hall, so that it's not just almost a sort of an application to the exterior, but it works right the way through into the interior, and the delicacy of those tiles and the colouring of those tiles. I mean, it is a work of art, but it also is something which is used by millions of people every year. So it would be very easy for it to look maybe not at its best, but it's not something, you know, the old station was looking very tired, and, you know, and people made the comment that it wasn't their favorite station. Lots of people didn't like going there because not only was it hectic, but actually the surroundings themselves weren't pleasant. And now you have something which is beautiful, which is calm, which is serene, but also, you know, as you say, the materiality sits very well with the background and the purpose.
Yes, definitely. I would like to touch upon a bit more of a general topic, looking at design and inclusivity in 2021. And I think we need to unpack who has access to public space, you know, what social spaces are, and public infrastructure as well. If we're critical about who makes decisions about design, and you know, who makes decisions with regards to regeneration in a city like London, I think one thing that strikes me in the conversation that we've had was about the concept of regeneration as a tool of social and public cleansing. I wonder what lessons we can learn from, you know, these processes and how we can unpack them.
I think the main thing for me is the recognition of what gentrification means, and what regeneration can become a code word for. So there are huge regeneration schemes going on at the moment, and I don't know how the architecture profession has got itself into a situation where one practice thinks it's okay to design a community of 5,000 for 5,000 people or more, 10,000, 20,000. And there doesn't seem to be any recognition that that scale of operation is not just socially inimical, but it also delivers a very poor product. Because inevitably what you see are a series of cut and paste jobs. And that's not, from my point of view, that's not designing for people, for real people and real lives. And quite often, speaking to people who have, who live in so-called new developments, particularly from diverse backgrounds, feel that those homes are unfit for their purpose from the day they move in. You know, so then you have people who feel, you know, where an estate has gone through a series of cycles of regeneration, where people have been moved out, where they've been promised that, you know, you may be losing your home now, but, you know, you'll be given a lovely new home and the future will be perfect. And actually, when they move in, they find that the accommodation that they have is not to the standard that they expected. So they've lost their community and those original connections that they had. And they look across the square and there are these towers which are full of people who are paying 500,000 pounds to live in standards of accommodation which are better, certainly better than the accommodation that they've been given. And then there's a whole conversation about poor doors and who comes in where, and, you know, the recognition that they're inferior beings because they get to come in one end of the development, and the wealthy, the great, the mighty, the great and the wealthy go in the other end of the, you know, so it's actually not, it's not just social engineering, it is social cleansing, but it's also reinforcing structures, social structures, by means of architecture and design. And I really think that, well, I'm surprised that architects continue to participate in systems that I feel not only do not enhance people's lives, but effectively degrade the, you know, the status of people, many of whom are already disadvantaged. So, and I think part of the problem with the pedagogical process in architecture is that politics is denigrated. So if you are thought to be a political architect or a political student, it is a way of saying you're not really a designer, you're not really an architect, because your focus is on politics rather than architecture, as if there's a difference between the two. I mean, it's a bit like the old days when people used to say, well, let's keep politics out of sport, you know, and then you come to Black Lives Matter and people taking the knee, and the Olympics and South Africa, and you just know that life and politics, sport and politics, architecture and politics are entirely integral. And if you don't integrate them at the pedagogical stage, then you get into trouble, as we see in Grenfell, you know, because architects are incredibly powerful, but quite often don't recognize their power. So don't stand up and say, no, we will not do that, or let's do it like this. This is a better way. And I think that is where architecture is really, where there's a real gap in architectural education, is the power and control and responsibility that we have as architects is de-emphasized and does us as a profession and also our clients and society a disservice.
The power of saying no to something and standing up is integral to our practice. We might not have the power to make the biggest decisions, but you definitely can say no to something if it feels off.
Yes, or you could say, no, this is a better, let's do it this way. This is a better way. Yeah. And explain why this is a better way. And quite often, I mean, you know, if you're working with developers and they're thinking in terms of commodity and pounds, shillings and pence, you can actually explain that whatever your target is, whatever your aim is, denigrating people through the process of architecture is not going to get you where you want to get.
I guess I was wondering how you think emerging architects from minority backgrounds can and should be supported to deliver projects, and possibly they would be able to address equity in a different way because of their background and their viewpoint. We know that the curriculum in architecture schools is dominated by Western and male perspectives. We also know that the profession is disproportionately dominated by advantaged white and male backgrounds and viewpoints. And that results in practitioners from minority backgrounds having considerable challenges progressing into roles or developing their own practices and projects. How do you think we can work towards a more diverse profession that allows us to make decisions that are more equitable and put social value at the center?
Well, I think that one of the ways is to free oneself from the idea that you're training for 7 years, you're giving up 7 years of your precious young life just so that you can go and get a job that pays you £18,000 a year. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And if you are going to sacrifice your precious young life, and you've already taken a massive risk by paying your fees, by the support that you've had from your parents, particularly if you're from a disadvantaged background, that's quite often a huge sacrifice that your family, your extended family has had to make. And then I think, it's incumbent on you to live your life and to live your life to the best of your ability and not to sell yourself short. So if you've taken that risk for 7 years, why not take another risk and say, I am going to do the best architecture I can for my community. And if you come from a minority background, there are your faith groups, there are your community groups, there are your church groups, there are any number of people, a number of groups who need your services, and who, if you think hard and you work with your colleagues, you can make your own client groups. You can make your own client groups, you can develop your own brief, you can find your own sources of finance. And in doing that, you begin to provide a real service to not just your community, but you're also opening up the world of architecture and possibilities of architecture to society as a whole. Because in my view, the architecture that we have in this country is probably, I don't think it's fit for purpose, but it's not even beautiful, and it's not, the architecture and the public domain are the same, whether you're in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Russia, China, the materials are the same, the thinking is the same, the CAD programs are producing the same result. So I think we just need to step out of that. And I know you've been working on something called Part 4. And I think that Part 4, maybe Part 5 and Part 6 is saying, well, I've done these 7 years, I've made my final submission. I can now escape from this what for some people is a really difficult experience, and just stop and think, how can I best use the talents and skills that I have? But I think part of the process of architecture is, there's a sort of imperative, you do part 1, you do part 1, you do part 3, and then you have to get a job, any job. And, don't get a job, any job, just give yourself a break, appreciate the fact that this is a great achievement in your life, that you've got Part 1, a degree, then you have a master's. I mean, for most people in the world, having a degree is something really stunning, but not for architects. You've got Part 1, and then you're casting around for part 2, you get part 2, and then you somehow need to get on the treadmill for part 3, and you get part 3, and then you're stuck in a big room, quite often with people you don't like terribly much, doing work that you're not that happy with. So I think valuing ourselves and valuing our skills and realizing what an achievement it is to do that time, and really treasure the skills and the talent that the 40,000 of us in this country have, and think, if we work together, if we think together, we can make the most tremendous difference.
That's a really great way of looking at it, and brings me to developing empathy as when you're practicing architecture. I think that's a concept that comes to mind when you say let's work together. How can we collectively address this diversity crisis and work towards a more equitable industry? How do you think empathy can be, and feeling, for someone else's perspective, can be developed?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to have a feeling for yourself, and a recognition of what a precious creature you are in yourself. And many of us dismiss that as being selfish or proud, or any number of derogatory adjectives. But I think valuing oneself and particularly valuing your feelings and your understanding and your experience is the first step, or the first few steps towards empathy. Because if you don't value yourself and you don't value the soft things, the fellow feeling, you're not likely to understand or empathize with other people. And quite often those kinds of feelings, those kinds of skills, are called soft skills in a kind of dismissive way, but they're not soft skills. They're really, really important, I feel, really important skills. And those are the skills and the understanding and the capacity, to me, that make the difference between science and technology and art. I mean, you can't have the architecture without the technology, but if you have the technology without the art and without the empathy, then you get, well, the result is we can see around us, and it's the sameness, it's the uniformity, it's the lack of spirit and soul, and those are intangible things. But I think these are things that lots of architects as young people go into the profession with an abundance of those skills and that kind of understanding. And gradually, I know we were talking about it the other day, through a series of submissions, it gets drummed out of you. So, it's a process, a continuing process of submission to the hierarchy, to the frameworks, to the understanding, and to technology. So, the cities that we see around us are subservient quite often to the technology. And as we lose the skills of drawing by hand, of painting, of craft, of pottery, of doing all those things that I think are absolutely integral, an integral basis to understanding the craft, the art and the craft and the technology of architecture, we end up with cities that look like computer games, computer models, and quite often I think it's the same kind of mindset that designs the computer games, the sort of shoot 'em up computer games, that designs cities. And you can see the same kind of aesthetic. And I think we somehow need to row back from that and discover the power of drawing And the coordination between hand and eye, and understanding about life drawing, drawing from nature. That, I think, makes a difference between something which is technically proficient and something which is beautiful, and I would call architecture.
That's a really, really great thing that everyone can take to heart. And actually,
well, I mean, life drawing. You actually only need a pencil and a piece of paper. It's really cheap. You don't need to go and buy yourself a computer to become really proficient in those skills. Yeah,
if anyone takes one thing away from this talk, is to do that more, to be creative more, and you can start with a pen and paper. I think that's a great thing to say. I think there's a general understanding that architecture and design, practicing it doesn't necessarily mean becoming an architect, and this pressure of having to fit this mold that is prepared for you when you go through education. And then what you talked about just now, looking at creative sides of things, or looking at planning and urbanism, I think there's so much more that you could do when you go through this education, and we should probably celebrate that much more. And as you also said earlier, that delivering a project is a team effort. It's not just one architect that does it, but there's a whole team involved in all aspects of the design, right? So yeah, I think that's something that, if we have any emerging practitioners in this talk, that they can take away, that there's not just one way of coming out of architecture schools, but there's a lot of options that are equally exciting.
Well, I mean, I think if you go through architecture, then it's, you might come out as a filmmaker. You might come out as a painter. There are any number of skills that we learn as architects that are bundled into this overheated experience. And I think part of the thing of taking a deep breath is to disaggregate, to separate all those things you've learned over all that time, and really find your heart and decide what it is, how you want to spend not all your life, but an important part of your life.
Definitely. I have one final question for you today. How has the Green Park Station project informed your future practice or future projects? And yeah, thinking about this collective way of working maybe as well.
Well, I think it made me think about access in a completely different way. I've thought about access in terms of wheelchair. I've thought about wheelchair access a lot. But that combination of creating something which not only gives you access in terms of simple mobility, which is really important, but also gives you access into the landscape, access to architecture, access to resources. And then, so that was really, really important. And also access to leading a team. I mean, when I was in practice on my own, there is absolutely no way I would have got anywhere near a £60 million project. But if you have a champion, if you have a patron, if you have somebody who recognises something in you, which I was lucky enough to find in Paul Rensard and Feilden+Mawson, and I would say, well, I can't do that. Well, of course you can do that. Getting sort of pushed forward is a really, really important thing, because it is quite daunting. And likewise with the Supreme Court, but I can't do it. This is the most important court in the UK. Well, of course you can do it. You've got 3 weeks, just get on with it. And that is just that fantastic. If you don't have confidence in yourself, to have somebody else have confidence in you, then reverberates and is a sort of positive cycle. And then moving from there, you see, I had so many different ideas about accessibility. So when I started working with Yinka Shonibare on his Lagos house, those lessons from Green Park and the idea of the choreography of accessibility was really important, because Yinka's stance is, I am not disabled, I live in a disabling environment. So, to work with him to create that enabling environment when he already had a very strong vision has been a real privilege, and I think without Green Park, without the lessons of Green Park, and without that, the confidence that the practice had in me to lead a team, to help to lead the team, I wouldn't have gone on to work so happily, which I have done with Yinka. And I hope next year, when the project opens in Lagos, people will agree.